my maiden name. I was born August the 14th in 1920, and I live in the house I was born in. My grandparents and my great-grandfather came from Sweden and settled in Kansas and then made the run into Oklahoma on a Jenny Lind mule riding double. My grandfather settled on a farm down by Mutual, left my grandmother, his father, who could not speak a word of English, my mother and my uncle down there, and he came to Woodward and built a feed store in what they used to call East Denver, or First Street in Woodward. Then he met a man by the name of Brockhouse, who was a German descendant, and they went into partnership.
What was your grandfather's name?
Oh, my grandfather's name was Peter Martinson. Yes. And they went into built a two-story brick building on Main Street. And it was the first two-story building in town, brick.
What year?
Oh, dear, I left those dates all at home, honey. What was that date? 1894. The year after the run. And they had an opera house up above the store. My grandfather had a general merchandise store, Peter Martinson General Merchandise, and Hiram Brockhouse had a saddle shop, the Woodward Saddle Shop. And then the stairs went up the center of the building into an opera house, and everything was held in this opera house in Woodward. The first graduating class of Woodward, the court, all the social events, even the community Christmas tree was held up there. My grandfather, in about a year, brought my great-grandfather and his wife and two children to town, and they lived in the back of the store. And they lived there when the saloon next door to the store, they had the famous shooting of the Temple Houston Jack Love, and my mother has told me of that night many, many times.
Okay, tell me about it.
Well, she said that she was a child, but it was stuck in her memory so because it was an unusual night. Mm-hmm. And a lot of commotion in there, and my grandfather heard the shots, and he wanted to go in, and my grandmother wouldn't let him because she was afraid, mm-hmm. and she didn't want him to get involved in the fight. And it was rumored that the lights went out, and that the judge's son was shot, you know. Mm-hmm. It was also rumored that Temple Houston had shot him, and pretty well known in town, but he was acquitted of the crime after years.
Do you remember why?
Mother never did know why, particularly. She was afraid of Temple Houston. She said he did go down Main Street shooting off his guns because he did drink. Mm-hmm. And when he would go down the street riding, she would hide behind her mother's aprons because she was so afraid of him.
Yes.
And he had small feet and walked very daintily. You know, was a big man, but had an unusual walk about him for being so large. Mm-hmm. The next morning after the fight, she said she found a carpet slipper in the alley back of the store from somebody running from the fight, you know. Mm-hmm. And I asked her why she didn't say that carpet slipper. But she has told me of the first graduating class in Woodward. She said there were 3 young ladies, and they were dressed in white, and they come down the Opera House aisle carrying a long-stemmed red rose, and she thought they were the most beautiful girls, you know.
Do you remember their names?
No, I can't offhand tell you their names. It's in the museum, but I just can't offhand tell you their names. Mm-hmm. And then she remembers one time at a community Christmas tree program there, of having a large tree and the candles on it, and the whole town came, which was only about 500 at that time. And there was a beautiful doll on the tree dressed in red, and she wanted that doll so bad, and it did belong to her. And she said the night after that, her folks had a hard time getting them to sleep in the store because my uncle wanted to ride his tricycle, which he got, and she wanted to play with her doll. But she told me many, many stories of that time in her life because she was about, at that time, 6 or 7. They later moved to a house back of what is today the Bank of Woodward, then across the tracks north, and Grandfather bought quite a bit of property over in there. And then later they moved up on South 8th Street, and my aunt still lives in that home today. Just a block, just a house from me, just, you know. So my grandparents, I was 16 when they died, so I remember them very well. I just noticed.
But sure.
And so I remember them very well. My grandfather spoke broken Swedish, and he was mayor of Woodward several times. He was mayor when Woodward Main Street was paved, when we got our White Way, when the convention hall was built, when the Carnegie Library went in, and he was the first superintendent of schools. He was first president of the school board in Woodward. And then my father came along, and he was mayor several times. And he was mayor when Crystal Beach Park was formed and the brick wall put around the cemetery. And I can remember all this very well because by then I was a young lady.
Yes.
And he would get me to enter the bathing beauty contest at that time in the 30s because he thought that if I entered, my friends would enter, and then we'd have a nice attendance, which really did happen. So when we were about 16, 17 years old. My father was a great baseball player. He was in the minor leagues as a young man, going up into the major when he met my mother, and retired because in those days it was a disgrace to marry a ball player. And eventually went into the grocery business with my grandfather, who by then had built another store and owned numerous businesses in Woodward. He always loved baseball. He spent a fortune on baseball in Woodward. He promoted it throughout this area. In my own home.
Did he organize teams?
Yes.
And
he
young
managed
boys?
Yes, of young boys. He played till he could no longer play. He was a tall, skinny man, and he played first base. But he finally got too old, and then he would organize young boys and pay them to play here and go after them, you know. He promoted it. He would bring them. I lived in a house with a basement in that time, and I always had ball players in the basement during the summer that my father would get out of college and bring to play ball. Now, Fuller Ball Field is named after him here, you see. So,
well, what happened to the store?
My father sold the store eventually, built another store on Main Street where Otasco is today. It was Martinson Grocery Store for many, many years there. Even after he died, my parents run the store. It was in business here for over 60 years.
Grocery store?
A grocery store. Before they closed it because it had became, the grocery store on Main Street was no longer a profitable business because your big industry was moving in, you see. During World War I, my grandfather had heard that castor beans were very profitable. And he told the farmers here in this country that if they would plant castor beans, he would give them $1.10 a bushel for them. So they planted over 2,000 acres of castor beans in here, from the field station to where TG&Y is now, was solid castor beans.
That would be quite a sight to see a field like
and
that.
then on out where the school is in the north part of town was all full of castor beans. And many of the students of that time said the teachers would say, don't pick them, they're poisonous, and they'd have to watch the children real closely to be sure they didn't play in the tall castor bean pants. But he sold in 1901 3 carloads of those castor beans, train carloads of those castor beans to Kansas City. And in 1902 he sold 16 carloads of castor beans, and they used the oil from those castor beans to fly the airplanes in World War I.
Is that right?
he gave the farmers or the planters of that area $12,000 for their castor beans. So that is a
what did he sell them for? Did he make a good profit?
$1. He bought them. I don't know what he sold them for. I do know that he paid $1.10 for them. It was in the paper, but it never said what he sold them for.
I wonder what they produced an acre.
I have no idea about that either. Now, it might be in an old newspaper, and I haven't written it down. I have read the old city minutes here down at the Civic Center. Go in and read all the old minutes that are in longhand, and they're very hard to read so that I can get the accurate dates on a lot of them. Because of my ancestors being so involved with making the city of Woodward, it has become a real interest to me to know the exact dates, and they are at home. I'm sorry I just didn't bring it.
You should take a recorder down and read out loud.
Yes, I guess I should, just to tell them. Because when they had the fight over Main Street being paved, they had very big political fights in Woodward, and as a child I can remember the folks, now they never talked to us directly, but I could see that they were disturbed. And I could see that my grandfather was hurt at one time, and it disturbed me because he was hurt, because I loved him as my grandfather did. One of the fights was over the paving of Main Street, and I do have all that at home. I'm sorry, I didn't know you wanted all that. There was a fraction of the political bosses at that time, so to speak, wanted brick paving, and my grandfather wanted concrete, and he wanted it so thick, and he wanted it to stay there permanently, and he wanted it so wide. So on the city commission at that time, if they didn't vote the way he wanted it to, he had the power of veto, and he just kept vetoing till he got it the way he wanted it. And it's quite an interesting story, or procedure to read. And then they put up the White Way, which I have found some of the poles and had put up in front of the Pioneer Museum and around the Civic Center. He did get the depth he wanted, he got the width he wanted, and everything. And he got it paved from 6th Street to 22nd Street the first time, you see. But he was a determined man to have his way. I remember him as a very quiet man. My grandmother was Pennsylvania Dutch, and he had met her. He landed in the United States with 25 cents in his pocket, and he was very wealthy when he died. He met her in Illinois, and they come to Kansas and then on into Oklahoma.
Where did her folks come from?
She was Pennsylvania Dutch, so she come from Germany. They are all of German descendants. We still, every Christmas in my family, have the shoe-fly pie for breakfast on Christmas morning. We have the potato dressing with our turkey for Christmas noon, and we carry on a lot of the old traditions from the family.
That's nice.
My grandfather had one sister who stayed in Sweden with the mother, and the cousins and I visit back and forth with one another so that I know where he was born and went to school, and my ancestors are buried in Sweden, and it makes it the world is a small place anymore.
Have you been to Sweden?
Oh, yes, I have been there and visited in their homes and met all the relatives there and have seen where the great-grandmother is buried. The great-grandfather is buried here. The great-grandmother in Sweden, you know.
She never did come.
No, he could not get her to come, and he would not stay in Sweden with her. My grandfather would put him on the boat and send him back or take him back, and he would follow him on the next boat over, and it happened so often that the officials in Chicago knew him and would call my father and say, "Mr. Martinson, your father is here again."
Your grandfather?
No, it would have been my grandfather's father.
He called my father.
Yeah, is here in Chicago again, and grandfather would send him the money to bring him here. And mother says he was a small man, and he would stand in front of Peter's store in the mud and so proud that his son had a store, because the Swedes in those days were very poor in Sweden. They certainly aren't now. They're very they have done very well. I married Wendell Plank in 1938.
Well, let's talk about your schooling now and as a girl growing up.
Mildred Hepner and May Van Dusen were my teachers in school here that are still living. I went to Little Central and to all my schooling here.
High school.
High school.
Did you go on to college?
No, I married right out of high school. I was one of the first rodeo queens here in Woodward. Yes, in 1937. The Sub-Debs, I was the organizer along with a bunch of my friends of the Sub-Debs here in Woodward and also of the Redink organization. And they nominated me for their candidate to be rodeo queen, and I won. And my mother went to Trigo's and asked them to make me a costume in black and white, and they made me a skirt of white corduroy trimmed in black and white oilcloth fringe that I've now given to the museum. And I still have people today say something about that costume. It's so unusual, you know.
Now, the skirt?
It was a split skirt.
Yes.
A riding habit.
What about the jacket?
I had a white satin blouse with black star buttons down the front, and I had a suede white bolero jacket trimmed in black, and I had a big white cowboy hat and black and white boots. So my costume was all black and white. In those days, very pretty.
And did you have to ride a horse?
Yes, and I had never ridden. And when they voted me, she could talk to me all day. When they voted me to be Sub-Deb representative, my father said, then if you're going to do it, you're going to learn to ride. And he got a man that was a farmer out by Fargo by the name of Mr. Fessler. And I had to go out there every day and take riding lessons. And it was a big stallion, beautiful horse, and a woman had never rode him. And they didn't tell me that, and I got on him, and he tried to throw me off, and luckily I hung on. But in 3 months' time, I got pretty good and rode well in the parade and stuff because my father was sure that I was going to, you know, and I was too. I had the same determination to make a good show, you know.
That's really great.
And then but I had met Wendell, who was a famous football player, all-state in football and basketball, and we fell in love, and we married, and he then, he was older, and he worked on the Fort Supply Dam out here when we were first married, and we had 4 children, 2 before the war and 2 after the war, and he went into, he went in, I've got that down someplace. He went in April of 44 and was with the 330th Engineer Division. He was sent to India and was camped up in the mountains of Burma. And their troops took convoys through on the Lido Road. He was a surveyor, and they would keep the Lido Road repaired, and they would take the convoys through from India to China and then fly back over the hump and then start again, you see. So it was a very interesting thing. He did that for 2 years before he got home.
He wasn't in any battles there?
No,
in the
no. He can tell a lot of the stories of the experiences in China particularly.
Can you remember one?
Yes, all the cities in China were walled at that time, and he would go up, and there would always be women waiting for them, you know. And then he said that they had no respect for life like he did. And one time, a bunch of the Chinese soldiers were in a truck going down the highway and run over a small boy, and all laughed about it as they went on their merry way. And he said life meant very little to them. They had no respect. He said the Indians were about as bad in India. He had great respect for the Burmese. He said the chiefs of the Burmese tribes up in the mountains kept very good control of their women, particularly. But they would come down out of the mountains of Burma and want some medical attention. And they would be high on some kind of marijuana or dope of some kind. And they would be treated. And he said some of them, he would wonder how they could ever go back up to their little camps. And they would take another smoke another pipe full of something, and then walk off, and disappear. And they had to sleep in hammocks because of the wild animals there, the tigers and so on. And it was a law where they stayed that if they shot at a tiger or saw them, to kill him, not leave him wounded.
Mhm.
And one time they found one and all began shooting, and he had like 21 bullets in him when they all the soldiers there at that time, before they finally killed him.
Mhm.
But he tells of the monkeys and the bananas and the elephants they rode, and the different things. It was very primitive. It was very primitive
Yes.
life that they lived, the soldiers there at that time.
And what other wild animals would they have there?
The water buffalo, the rhinoceros,
Oh.
and I have pictures of him riding on the different, or with the different animals. I have a picture of the tiger they shot, the snakes, a lot of the snakes.
Those big,
Pictures.
what kind of snakes?
I couldn't identify them. I just know there is some snake pictures there with them. In China, they did ride in the rickshaw around the city. In Kunming is where they would go with their supplies.
Mhm.
So it was a very interesting time. He said he only wished he'd have been older so he could have appreciated what he was seeing and what he was living through, because at that time all he wanted to do was come home to his wife and children, you
Sure.
see. So he didn't really appreciate.
He probably
He
got home.
sent home some beautiful things. He sent home one box I never did get of jewels and rocks.
Oh.
And I never got it. But I did. He did bring home a lot of brass and from India, and some beautiful handwork and lace work from Burma and China,
Mhm.
and other trinkets of different things. You see, he was a corporal, and when he come home, the children didn't know him naturally, because
yes.
he'd been gone too long.
Mhm.
And
They were
you have
small.
to say, "This is your daddy." Yes,
Yes.
they were only a year and 2 years old when he left.
You
see,
should
and
have put
4
his
and 5.
picture out.
Oh, I did have a picture of him out.
Mhm.
But it's still, when he got home, he immediately changed from his soldier outfit to his civilian clothes.
Mhm.
And the little boy come up and said, pulled on my blouse and said, "Mother, where is my army daddy?" Because I had an army picture of him out, you see.
Yes.
But they adjusted very quickly
Mhm.
to him.
Mhm.
We had 2 other children after that, a girl and a boy, and 3 of those children live here in Woodward with the grandchildren,
Yes.
and 1 daughter in Denver. So
Mhm.
they carry on my love of Woodward and the community, you
Yes.
see. My husband was director of Kids Incorporated here for almost 25 years before he got to, before.
You remember where we left off?
Yes.
Okay.
Wendell was head of Kids Incorporated here for almost 25 years, and very much loved and respected in the community. When he was the football player in high school, they held a Wendell Plank Day, and later they held another, and when he was dying, they held another one. So that's quite an honor to a man.
Yes, it is.
They have a street named in front of the Kids Incorporated building, Plank Avenue Boulevard, and they are naming the new building the Wendell Plank Complex.
Oh.
So it's quite a tribute
Yes.
to a man who gave his life to the community, really.
Yes,
He was a charter member of the Kids Incorporated board. He was an American Legion commander. He was a member of both the VFW and the American Legion, and very active in supporting those 2 groups.
Mhm.
So, can you think of anything else, honey, right off?
What did he work at for a livelihood?
Kids Incorporated director. That's a paid
At the
position.
paid job.
Yes,
Mhm.
that's a paid position.
Mhm.
So sometimes it did not pay very well, and sometimes it was a real struggle with 4 children to get by.
Yes.
My mother and father had pretty well spent their inheritance through the store before it went broke, and through Daddy's baseball endeavors.
Yes.
So there was not a lot of money left to me either.
Mhm.
I took care of all 4 of the children, the 2 while he was gone, of course, in the service. And then I took care of his mother and father and my mother and father as they died, and my mother for almost 19 years. So it was, a busy life for me with the
Where
family.
did his people come from?
My father's people?
No, Mr. Plank.
Oh, they come from Mutual. His grandfather and grandmother were not poor like mine when they come into this country. They come in a covered wagon, and they had their furniture with them. And he was a Civil War veteran, Wendell's grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And his grandfather was on a pension of $100 a month. I have sent for his war record and have it at home.
Mm-hmm.
He
Which side did he fight on, his grandfather?
from Pennsylvania, from the north. Yes, he came from Pennsylvania. He met his future wife there, and they moved to Missouri before they come to Oklahoma and settled at Mutual. But she had money. Her father had come from Ireland, and he was a wealthy, educated, red-headed Irishman, and he left his daughters quite well-to-do. And
what line of business was he in?
He never worked. Mr. Plank never. The grandfather Plank never worked because he had this pension from the Civil War, and his wife had money.
Well, I mean the money. The wife.
The wife's father.
Uh-huh.
I'm not for sure. He was a college professor, I think.
Mm-hmm.
He was a very learned man.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But they lived in a big house down by Mutual and talked of seeing the Dalton brothers gang come through there one time and getting pie from them,
Yes.
And they assuredly give it to him because they were afraid,
Sure.
Mr. Plank and married a Nelson. She married George Nelson's, it would be George. She would have been George Nelson's aunt.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of those children. There were 9 in Mr. Plank's family, and I think 10 in hers. So there was a lot of those children.
Yes.
Our family, my side of the family, did not have that many. Mr. Plank, Wendell's father, did just like grocery clerk or something like that. He never did a lot of
How
work.
many brothers and sisters did you have?
I had a brother and a sister. I had my brother's in Colorado now and my sister in Arizona. The only ones left of the original Martinsons are my Aunt Esther, who was a Martinson, and I think she has been interviewed on another tape one time. And then my family, and that's the only ones left in Woodward. But we have always lived in the same section of Woodward for many, many years.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else?
Well, anything that you can think of now in your work with the museum?
I was
When
the
did you
starter
start?
of the museum. I am one of the few charter members of the Historical Society in Woodward. There are only 2 of us still living, Tom Wright and myself. And it was my idea that it was time to preserve history, and I belonged to a sorority at that time, of which I was a charter member. It was Gamma Sorority. And I appointed a committee to look into the starting of the museum and United Fund in Woodward. So I guess I'm as involved in different things as my ancestors. We formed this committee and got a group together and wrote for our charter, and for many years we did not have a building, but we would meet and talk of writing a book and doing great things, And then the Williamses give us the money for the building. I have been secretary, treasurer, vice president, president, and curator at the museum.
You should know all about
so
the museum.
From the start, I have done all the restoration work and a lot of the book work, and I'm very familiar from the ground up how museums operate, naturally.
And then you helped on this book.
Yes, I've helped.
Devil's
I helped
Gap.
a lot on Devil's Gap. I would go. Louise was new here, and she didn't know people, and I knew so many people. And it's funny, but when you interview older people, in their homes, they're rather reluctant to talk unless they know you well.
That's right.
And they would say, well, I'll talk to Marcella.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would go out and get their histories for the history books we published, and a lot of them would not have given them if I hadn't have gone for the interviews.
Did you
And
work
I
on
took
the
her to
history?
Sealing, I took her to Supply, I took her
Oh.
to Moreland, and would introduce her, and then I would talk to them as she taped and wrote notes, you see.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very interesting work. It was
Yeah.
always something new, going on that we were involved in.
And it's work that you like.
Yes,
do.
if I have to work, that's where I want to work.
Mhm.
It's very neat and clean work, except when I was wallpapering or something. Both times that the museum was built, we would never have opened had I not gone in and done the cases and started. This last time, Mrs. Ruttman took ill, and when they asked me to come out and run it again, I went into that back new part, and there was 4 walls and nothing else.
Mhm.
And so when I go in, it's a great accomplishment to see the bank and
Yes.
the other things
Oh, that's
that I've
marvelous, the things that they have in there.
done. Yeah. So one afternoon, Mr. Nile came in to buy a book from us, and I did not know him. And he said, Marcella, you don't know me. And he wouldn't have known me had I not had my name tag on. And he said, I'm Nile Bynum. And I said, oh, yes, I vaguely remember you. But after 40 years, it's hard to remember people, that you haven't seen. And he called that evening and came by, and we visited. And from then on, he lived in Fort Collins, Colorado at the time, so he would call me long distance and sent me flowers and a card on Valentine's Day and so on. And then we were married in April in Shoshone, Wyoming. I'm a Methodist and he's a Catholic, and we were married in a Presbyterian church by a Baptist minister. So we've covered all bases now. And it was his children were there, and it was a very beautiful wedding, and we went on up to Jackson Hole for our honeymoon.
Oh, yes.
So we've traveled extensively since that time.
And have you been overseas?
Yes, I've been to Sweden and the Dominican Republic down at Casa de Campo. Yes, down at Casa de Campo.
Mm-hmm.
Niall has traveled more than I have overseas. But I had never been out of Woodward hardly till I met him. So he showed me California and so many wonderful places, Maine and so many places that I never dreamed I would ever get to see. It's been very.
Do you drive or fly?
We drive we flew back to Boston and then rented a car and went on up into Maine and back. But most of the time we drive because I'm so eager to gather rocks and pine cones. And I have many flowers in my home and cactus beds and things. I love things like that.
You're not an antique person?
And not particularly. However, one bedroom in my home is completely furnished with my grandparents' furniture.
Oh,
I call it the heritage room. I have pictures of them and old sheets of music and valentines and calendars and their gloves and their jewelry and hanging on the wall and their pictures, and it's very interesting. I do have other items throughout the home, but to go and buy antiques, no, I am not an antique. I've worked with it too long, and I don't care for them like I suppose I would. I have refinished too many of them. When I was a museum curator, I know they brought me an old metal icebox that had been in a dugout down by Arnett. It had dead mice in it, years of dirt and stuff. It took days and days to sand that down to the metal, then restore it, by painting it and fixing it for display. Another time I found an old bedstead, iron bedstead, beautiful, sitting by a chicken coop, and went up and asked the people if I could have it, and they give it to me. And I had to sand and paint, and so I'm not very fond of antiques because I've had to do too much of the grubby work on them for the museum.
I can understand that.
Our home is very different, isn't it? Because most everything I have in it, I've either cut down, handmade, or done over, haven't I?
But everything has a story behind it.
Yes, everything has a story behind it. I have an old plow disc I foiled. It holds my magazine racks on a pedestal and different things like it. Everything has a story behind it or has been in the family. So the dishes, I have some beautiful dishes that have been in the family that are really pretty.
Where did the kitchen table come from?
The kitchen table and the buffet and the chairs come from the Houston family. I bought it for $25 when I was first married to Wendell, and painted it. Oh, that was a mistake, but that was in my ignorant young years.
I know.
And used it in the basement for years for my scout troops. You know, for every child I had a Brownian scout troop. And so used it for years for parties and stuff. Then I decided to refinish it and fix it, and now it's in my kitchen, and the table is beautiful. It's really a pretty table.
What kind of wood is it?
I don't know, and anybody that I ask doesn't know, and usually I can tell wood, but this is very different. It's very different looking.
It's a hard wood sometimes.
Yes, it's a hardwood, and it has a real dark streak through the light of it, and it's very beautiful. It's very different. I've never seen anything like it, and that's unusual because I can usually identify wood.
Would that be from Temple Houston's family?
I bought it from Dick and Bessie. Whether Temple used it or not, I have no idea.
Well, didn't Temple's father come here?
No, just Temple. Just Temple.
Sam.
Yes, Sam was his father. Yes, just Temple lived here. Now, my family was good friends to the Houstons, and I remember Dick and Bessie well. I do not, of course, remember.
Now, who's Dick and Bessie?
Dick was Temple Houston's son, and he was a very friendly person, I would say. Bessie, Mrs. Temple Houston and Bessie Houston were both our postmistresses here.
Oh.
Yes, and so that I knew them very well.
And Bessie is a daughter.
A daughter-in-law.
Daughter-in-law.
Yes, so I knew them very well. We were, my grandmother was one of the members of the early day members of the Methodist Church here. Not about a month ago was the 5th generation to be baptized in that church, and the little granddaughter wore my baptismal dress, and the one her mother was baptized in, and so it's very traditional. Our family's very traditional.
That's fine. That's wonderful. I like families to be that way.
Yes, we're very traditional.
Okay, is there anything else?
No, can you think of anything to say about our teachers? Only that our school was so much different then. During my senior year, I remember we had 3 superintendents. One of them was fired, another one absconded with some money, and by then we were running the school. And the teachers said it was the most miserable year they ever taught here.
I imagine so.
And we would go up and break out the fire alarm bells and take off on a skip day to the canyons north of town. And it was really rather sad as I look back on it, but
that sounds like a typical high
and then
school
we got a good superintendent here who settled us down, you see. And we would go through those caves a lot of times at my age when there was no lights or anything. We'd get a lantern or a flashlight and climb through the caves.
Where are these caves?
The Alabaster Caverns out
north.
Oh,
you'd go through that?
Oh, yes. And we would go where we'd come to one place, we'd have to crawl on our hands and knees through the water, and I'd go through them lit, and I wonder how in the world I ever went through there with just a flashlight. But there would be a bunch of the boys, or we would be on a picnic, and we'd decide to go through the caves. And my grandfather owned all of Ellendale, north of Woodward, where there were a lot of caves, see. And so we would go out there to spend the weekends and go through the caves. And one
How far
time,
north are those caves?
about 25 miles.
Straight north of Woodward?
Well, northeast.
Northeast. They weren't connected with the caves over there at Freedom then?
Yes, they're all connected.
Oh,
they're all connected in one way or another out there. But the ones by Freedom are the ones that we would, what we call the bat caves
cave.
then,
Mhm.
that we would go through, you
Mhm.
know, and the bats would come flying out, and they tell me now when I go through with the lights on that there was rattlesnakes in there, and I think, oh my land, why did we do that? But we finally got kind of cured one time we went out there and were exploring some of the many caves, and one of the boys fell off into a dark crevice.
Oh, my.
And we had to run for help and ropes and get him out, and it kind of cured us from doing that for a
I think
while,
so.
for us having fun, you know, as
You
we
didn't
called
have
it.
a tour guide or anybody
Oh
that
no,
been through
no,
there?
no. We just went out and would be like 10 of us in a group, you know, 5 couples of us or
Mhm.
something, and we would decide we were going through the caves or something. And
Well, did
we
you follow about the same trail as they go through now?
no, but they will show you the trail we used to go through, and I look at that place where we crawl through the water on our hands and knees and wonder, you know, how I had the nerve to do it. But when you're young, you do a lot of
yes.
foolish things, and that was one of my foolish.
Youth doesn't, you're not
No,
afraid.
no, we weren't afraid. I did enter bathing beauty contest. I did come in second one time, but I never made it to first place.
Oh.
But my father would, you know, insist on that. But it was a fun time. We didn't have money. We had to make our own amusement.
Yes.
I show my children how we cut out paper dolls and how we played and what we built. And Niall has made them wooden guns that he used to play with, and they think they're the greatest, you know. They think that's wonderful. But we show them how we had to make our own toys and how we played and what we did for our amusement.
And they can hardly believe it.
No, they can't believe it. They can't believe it. My one little granddaughter, her mother said she cut up magazines for days after I showed her how I made my paper dolls and houses, you see. But I used to love to go up to my grandmother's upstairs because she had old catalogs, and it was so much fun to ask her for one and take it home and cut it up, you know.
How did your parents stand the Depression in 1929?
Very well, because they had the grocery store, and but I remember wearing hose that were sewed up. You know, Mother would darn my hose, and we never had. Nobody had money, what you'd call just money, and you were all more or less in the same boat. So you never thought of being poor. It never dawned on me that anybody was poor or I was better than anybody, or there was no class distinction, because we were all living through a very bad time. Just like the Dust Bowl and the tornado and different things, we were all living through
Tell
that.
me about do you remember Black Sunday? April the 15th?
Oh, yes.
19th?
Oh, my, yes.
What were you doing?
We were in the house, and Mother saw the cloud coming, and she said, "Oh, get the wet towels." And my sister and I run and helped her wet towels to lay all around in the windows. And I remember we were very depressed, just sitting in the house and just watching the church, you know. Not long, a few years ago, there was a dust cloud come up, and I just got hysterical, and the kids got tickled at me, my children. But they hadn't seen what I had seen or lived through what we had lived through. And to me, that was a horrible time, because you could, you know, no matter how much you tried to keep it out, it was there.
Yes. You couldn't keep it out.
No, you couldn't keep it out.
Did it get so dark that you couldn't see your hand before your face?
Yes. It was really bad. It turned night. It just turned night that
What time
time.
did it strike here at Woodridge?
I can't remember the time.
It's about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
What was it? I can't remember for sure. I just remember wetting those rags and running, and we had an upstairs, and running and putting them in all the windows, and how frightened I was, depressed, or it had an odd feeling to us.
Well, we went to school the other day when the lights were on.
Oh,
the
yes.
lights would be on and everything.
Oh, yes.
All
They would
day long.
have to turn on the school lights because of the dust outside, and it just penetrated you, everything.
Did the dust cause any sickness? Dust pneumonia?
Yes, my grandmother died of asthmatic condition during that time.
Well,
She died during that time.
the further west you go, I think that Black Sunday was worse.
Yes,
trouble
I
there.
imagine.
I have interviewed people out at Guyman and out at Boise City, and from what they tell me, it was so much worse out there than what there was where I lived.
Mhm.
I lived in the southeastern corner of Beaver County, close to Slapout.
Yes.
You know where
Yes, I know
Slapout
where
is.
Slapout is, and Beaver and all those places. But now the tornado, the night of the tornado, we were sitting on the floor with our two children, and my husband said, my dog started crying. His ears were evidently stopping up because he started crying. And my husband went out on the front porch, and he says, hit the floor, a tornado's coming. And we grabbed the children, one of them, we'd only had the two then, and put one under me and one under him, and my roof just swayed back and forth, and I had water blow in the house. I don't know how, but my house held. We were hysterical afterwards.
Sure.
I couldn't remember that one of the children wanted me to recite a poem, and I couldn't remember anything. Only the horror of that noise, you know. We went to the back windows of our house and saw the town burning, and he left immediately and went downtown to help. I give him all my bedding, all my quilts and things I had, and of course now I wonder where some of those beautiful things are.
Yeah, sure.
You couldn't see your hand in front of your face that night.
Oh, is
You
that
could
right?
not. It was the blackest night. I lived a half a block from the highway and couldn't see to walk that half a block, and the mud was that deep, you know. I stayed home with all the children of the family that night while the others went to pick up the wounded and the injured, and we had a delivery truck. And they went out in the delivery truck picking them up and taking them to places of shelter. So it was a very bad night. My youngest child sat on my lap all night, was still frightened.
Yes.
But it was a very, everyone in Woodward was affected one way or another. We had relatives that were wounded or ill, or friends who were killed, and so it touched everyone who lived here at that time. It was a very bad time for Woodward.
You say you got water in, but it didn't break any windows out.
No, the only thing we could figure out, it lifted the house and blew the water in because I had water in all the west of my house, clear to the center of the house. But there was no sounds of how it got in there.
It couldn't have lifted the
Roof?
roof.
We don't know. We have no idea. There was just water in all the west side of the house, and no apparent reason how it got in there.
I interviewed a lady some time ago that went through the tornado that hit Slapout, and they had tree limbs and leaves in their house, and they don't know how that got in there unless it lifted the roof up. And
one other tornado that went through here in the about 1940, it was a smaller one. I told my husband, it looks so funny out. Get up, look out. It's something's happening. And he wouldn't get up till a tree in our front yard, a large tree, broke like a matchstick and went by our bedroom window. And he got up.
it was time to get up.
And the flower pot setting on the front porch didn't even blow over. The tornadoes are very frightening. It's unreal what they do.
I would think the noise would have been so terrible.
The night of the big tornado, the noise was deafening. It was very, it's just like a freight train going over your head. It was very deafening. You couldn't hear anything but the noise of the tornado, the night of it. He said he saw that wind just switch around into that funnel as it was boring down on Woodward, you know.
Well.
And, of course, from 9th Street out, there was nothing hardly left, you see.
9th Street. That's
the street,
yeah,
right, the main highway.
Yeah.
There was hardly anything left.
From there west.
West was gone.
As we were eating lunch today, a man said that that tornado just sucked the baby out of
the Damery
crib,
farm.
I believe.
It did. They had gone out to see the front, they went out on the front porch to see what was happening, and it sucked the baby out of her arms. They did find it later across
Was it in?
Across the
Was
river.
it still alive?
No.
Oh.
No.
They're across the river.
across the river.
Mm.
There was mail found up in Kansas. Of course, it was the longest tornado recorded in the United States. It set down in Texas and went clear to Kansas, you see. I used to know all the statistics when I would give tours at the museum, but it's been a few years and I've rather forgot them. But it is phenomenal to think that a tornado of that depth and fury could stay on the ground that long. It just almost mind...
didn't it skip places, though?
Not that I know of.
It hit Shattuck. Well, it didn't hit the town. It
was
hit
south of Shattuck as it comes through. The only thing, it went through open country most of the way till it hit Woodward.
Yes.
And the Indians used to say, my parents and grandparents have said, that a tornado would never hit here because of our river. And they never come near rivers or the valleys, and they skip over them. But it went right on through Woodward and right through that river, right on up to Kansas, you see. It was of a tremendous force.
Yes.
So
now we would be warned.
Yes, we would be. Our tornado here brought on National Weather Forecasting because they realized the devastation of it. And then Kansas City started into the weather warnings that we have today. So out of that tornado, that did come about. That they started warning people.
Do you remember how many was killed?
Over 100. And that is just at that time. Now, Wendell had an uncle who died a few months later as the result of that tornado. And there was lots of people that were injured for life from that tornado or died later within the year following from the trauma of that tornado. So it was very devastating.
We lived 50 miles west, and we were in the, what do you call those outside winds of that tornado? What did you call it? There's a name for it. Yes. My husband and son was down in the barn finishing up their chores, and the wind got so strong I got afraid, and I was afraid for them because the barn wasn't as strong as the house. I thought, well, I'll go down where they are. I couldn't get my doors open.
No, you can't. You can't open them.
And they couldn't get
You're
out.
at the mercy of the universe in this situation. It's
and you see here, we were 50 miles west of the center of that storm.
I thought that night as I sat there, no lights, no nothing, deathly rain and snow and so black, and I thought what it was like to be completely isolated in the world. It was time for a lot of thoughts that went through people's minds.
You mean it snowed?
The next morning it snowed on us, and we had snow on all this. And then the airplanes and ambulances for days, the continual funerals that went by, and the ambulances coming in. And then they put up an armed guard around the city to keep the looting out. And I lived at that time up at the end of the highway here. And so the people were lined up for miles or more coming into Woodward to see the devastation. And they were parking their cars and walking in to see it, coming from Oklahoma City and around to see the devastation. And you could see anything. You saw bathtubs up in trees. You saw fur coats up in the bathtubs. You saw everything. You saw anything you would want to see. That night, I first went with my husband in the truck, and I said, "Oh, take me home," because there was a lot of wires down and dogs barking and people screaming, and it was just a night you would never forget.
Yeah.
So that's.
And what about your neighbors' houses?
I lived on the other side of Ninth, and they were all, windows broken or roofs off, but it was not total devastation like it was from Ninth on out, where it was just, one friend of mine was working at the Oasis Steakhouse at that time, and when it hit, she got down by the counter, the bar, and the whole Oasis blew away at that bar. And she run home to her family, and her husband and her boy were dead, and the other boy badly injured. but she didn't have a scratch. You know, you
Mhm.
heard all kinds of stories.
Mhm.
I could go on for hours telling you of the stories from that, but
Mhm.
it would take entirely too long. So,
Well, can you think of one more story? I've got about that much on my tape left.
maybe you better tell a story you remember, honey. Can you?
I wasn't here, I just remember what happened to my grandfather, you know, I was.
Now, he come from an old
Could you
family.
move over here?
He come from an old family here,
Mhm.
also out by Tangier, the
Mhm.
L.S. Thomas family, and there are a lot of them still around here.
Yeah.
So,
Well, why don't you finish talking about the tornado,
Well,
and then I'll interview you separately for the rest.
both my sisters had homes here, and my youngest sister was saved only because of the fact they were at the theater that night, but they lost their home and everything they owned. And my older sister and her husband was saved because they were over in Texas at the time.
Mhm.
He worked on the railroad, and they got home, and there was nothing left but the foundation of everything that they ever owned was gone. And my grandfather was living right up where about where the post office is now and courthouse, and he was in bed in his BVDs, and he rolled underneath the bed, and he had one of those old cast iron bedsteads, you know.
Mhm.
And he rolled underneath the bed and held onto the bed, and his whole house disappeared except him, and that bed was the only thing left on the floor. Everything else was gone, the whole house and everything. Of course, he was pretty badly beaten up from it, you know, cut and scratched and this type of thing. But it left him in the bed there, and everything else in his house was totally gone except the foundation, see, you know. So that's the main thing. I had come down. I didn't try to come down for maybe 3 or 4 weeks after it was over with. I was going to school in Denver at the time, and I come down, and Jim Guest, his father, they run the airport here at the time, and he flew me over the city, you know, and you could still see it. They hadn't begun to get everything, you know, halfway cleaned up or nothing. And of course, the house that we'd lived in on Madison Street was completely gone, but my folks were living in Sharon by then, and they, you know, they
escaped.
They escaped it, you know. So that's about the main things I remember about it.
And now your name, for the record.
My name is Niall Ray Bynum.
The husband of
Marcella.
Marcella. What's your name? Fuller, Plank?
Bynum. That gets rather involved.
Okay, can you think of anything else about the tornado?
My folks had a big locker plant here at that time, and a generator come in on a truck and connected up and saved all the meat from that time, and that was very fortunate.
Yes.
Because they'd heard about it immediately. A lot of the grocery stores were not too badly damaged. The fronts were blown in or something like that. And they told me that after the show that night, the storefront was all in. And we had a big display of soap and stuff there, and people were running by just stripping it, just what they could reach, you know.
Yeah.
But that goes with disaster.
Now,
have
you
the
mentioned
looting.
about seeing the fire. Tell me
Yeah.
about that and what building burned.
Well, the old armor building down, where is that? What, is that Madison?
Brown Madison.
Brown Madison.
Madison.
That whole block caught on fire and burned, and so you could see the fire and no way to put it out. You had to let it go because, you know, the town, it's just like I suppose war would be like. You are at the mercy of whatever is happening at that time. All you can do is try to save lives and help people and so on.
Well, what started the fire?
Probably electric shorts.
Probably
and stuff,
electric
you know.
shorts, even though the electricity was turned out by Mr. Walker, who was working at the plant downtown and heard it coming and turned off the master switch to the town, which saved thousands of lives.
Yes,
It had not been for him. It would have been
Mr. Walker.
Walker.
What was his first name? Is that Leland's dad?
No, it's no relation
No
to
relation.
him. No. He got a medal of merit for being such a hero. He was killed during. Yes, he was killed. the tornado hit the building and demolished it, and he was buried in it. So it was a great feat of heroism on his part. But he did save a lot of lives by turning off that master switch to the town. You can't hardly describe the fear that envelops you,
Oh.
It's just, you just can't.
Well, a lot of people
But
probably
you were
figure the world has
saved,
come to
you
an
know.
end, you know.
My sister was playing cards above one of the stores downtown, and the whole front end of the building come in on them. She had very long hair, which was very popular in those days. And when she reached Mother's house, it was so full of plaster and concrete that it stood straight out from her head. They buried 6 children that they never identified. They never found their names. Nobody claimed them. I went to see them. They asked all the town to come down, and we had to take typhoid shots and so on to see if we knew these children. Nobody knew them. One child completely disappeared. They never did find. They never did find this child. She was in the hospital, the last they found of her, and somebody picked her up and took her, I guess.
I've heard that, and I wondered if it was so.
She belonged to a friend of mine. I knew the child. I knew both of the children, and the mother was a friend that I had taken baby presents to the children and this sort of thing, and she was killed. And so I knew the child, and they never did find her.
And you would have recognized her. She'd been one of those 6.
Yes, I would have recognized her. She was not one of the 6
And
buried.
nobody turned in.
No. No, it just was. I knew the family well. It was. I just wonder what happened to that girl. You know how you.
Yes.
So.
Well, you would wonder who would be that small to go and pick up a child and carry it off.
Carry it off
Yes,
at that
such
time.
a tragedy.
Uh-huh.
Well, Marcella, this has been great. I've enjoyed it,
Thank you.
and you have given us a good, wonderful history of the early days, Woodward, and also the latter day of Woodward. And I really thank you.
Thank
and I thank you, too, for your time.